Kevin is a principal project coordinator in the Business Economic Division of the Minneapolis Department of Community Planning and Economic Development. He started with the city in December of 2016. From January of 2007 through July of this year, he was directly involved in the preparation and submission of almost 489 exactly, successful brownfield and redevelopment grant applications that secured a total of $113 million plus in funding from federal, state, and regional and county grantors for Minneapolis development projects. And with that, Kevin, I will pass it off to you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you to Minnesota Brownfields for providing me with this opportunity to speak today. I was asked to talk about the brownfield aspects of probably one of the most significant series of events that have occurred in Minnesota, probably in its history, the civil unrest that occurred last year. And I think something that doesn't get enough attention are the brownfield aspects of that, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. As you all know, in 2020 and 2021, there were waves of civil unrest that occurred in Minneapolis, St. Paul, suburbs, many other places. Most of this was triggered by the death of George Floyd on May 25 of 2020. There were some subsequent waves of civil disobedience and violence and vandalism, but most of it occurred during a 4 or 5 day period between May 26 and May 29 of last year. It resulted in over $500 million in property damage, and I read an article that said it was the second most destructive period of civil unrest in U.S. history after the 1992 Los Angeles riots. So it's a very significant development. Damage and unrest occurred in many places. Minneapolis was probably hit the hardest, but Lake Street, almost the entire 5 mile length of Lake Street was affected. A 3.5 mile stretch of University in St. Paul. Nearly 150 buildings were either burned down or damaged in some way. Lots of vandalism, lots of headlines at the time. Maps of various kinds were generated at different stages to help people understand where this damage had occurred. All of the circles on this map indicate areas where something bad happened, either graffiti, broken windows, broken doors, looting, fires, etc. As you can see, the damage was concentrated in a couple of areas. It's not hard to see where downtown Minneapolis is, or Lake Street, or University in St. Paul. But it happened at scattered other locations. I live in Rosemount, and there's a court facility in Apple Valley that was vandalized, so it hit the suburbs too, but not as badly as the major metropolitan areas. Here's a different map that has different colors to show the levels of damage. The yellow dots are relatively minor damage, and as the dots get darker in color, it indicates a greater level of damage. The orange and red dots are places that were seriously damaged or destroyed. This is an article from June of 2020. At that time, Minneapolis officials determined that over 1,000 properties had been damaged. I think the final count was probably over 1,500 that sustained damage in one way or another. City staff members generated a couple of maps. Here again, we see dots. Here again, you see in Minneapolis, basically Lake Street cutting across the center of the city, and downtown Minneapolis as the locations where damage occurred. Here's a blown up version. It's a little fuzzy, but this is also Lake Street. You can see Pade-Makaska, formerly Lake Calhoun, on the left, crossing over the freeway, going all the way over to the river. Something happened on virtually every block along that stretch during that time. There were some smaller maps that were generated that showed specific areas. This is near Midtown Global Market. As you can see, again, the yellow are relatively minor damages, but there were buildings that were burned down and totally destroyed in that area and in many others. There was really no type of building or business that was spared, although it seemed as if in Minneapolis, at least, the vast majority of the damage occurred to restaurants and retail operations, maybe just because there's more of them than other types of businesses, but cell phone stores got hit, gas stations, some homes that lived in close proximity to University Avenue and Lake Street were damaged. Everybody suffered. Part of the reason this is important is because all these dots, or many of these dots on these maps, represent locations that have now presented or provided redevelopment opportunities. And they fall into a couple of different categories. There were some sites that are now completely vacant. The buildings were destroyed by fire, or they were damaged so severely by vandalism that they had to be taken down. The sites are completely cleared. That's kind of one category of redevelopment opportunity. The second category, I think, are severely damaged buildings that are still standing. Not all of them had to come down. The ones that were public safety risks, I think, were taken down. The ones that couldn't be secured to keep other vandals out, keep people from injuring themselves, those buildings came down. But the second category are buildings that could be secured in one way or another, but they just can't be redeemed. They can't be fixed. The damage was too severe. The third category, I think, are moderately damaged buildings. There were some that were broken into, looted, spray painted inside. If they were set on fire, maybe the fire was put out at a fairly early point, but there was water damage. There's a lot of salvageable buildings out there that can be fixed up, rehabbed, repaired, turned around to new uses in some cases, or made available to their original occupants. And the last category is kind of an interesting one. There were lots of buildings, as you may have seen from some of the earlier maps, there were lots of yellow dots. Those were buildings that weren't damaged all that badly, but they were damaged to some extent. And even if they don't need to be rehabbed, the damage to those buildings has prompted many of those property owners and business owners to consider whether they might want to change things, whether they want to sell that property to someone else for redevelopment, whether they want to redevelop that site for their own purposes. Frankly, as a city employee, most of the calls that I'm getting are from property owners in the fourth category. There's lots of people out there that are rehabbing their buildings and returning them to the original use, but there are lots of people who are now thinking, is this the best use for this location? And part of that is coming from the community engagement that's now occurring, especially along Lake Street and University. There are lots of neighborhood groups that are affected, lots of business groups, and they're having some very in-depth conversations about whether this business in this location is what the community needs. If this is not what the community needs, what would work better here? Can my property be used for that purpose? Can I be the developer of that property? If I can't, who can I sell it to who could do those things to benefit the community? In the 15 years that I've worked for the city, frankly, I've never seen so much community engagement over redevelopment opportunities as I've seen in the last 16 months. It's very refreshing and rewarding and interesting to see. Let me give you a couple examples of these various categories. Here's a headline back from June of 2020. This is the 7 Sigma site. It's a large manufacturing operation, burned pretty much all the way down to the ground. Had lots of employees. They did plastic fabrication and various other things on the 26th Avenue South. This is one of the few parts that was literally left standing. The rest was pretty much burned to the ground. So the 7 Sigma site, good alliteration there. The 7 Sigma site is one of those that's now being looked at because of the redevelopment opportunities that it presents. And it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Almost all these properties present brownfield issues of one kind or another. In many cases, there was a building sitting on top of contamination that didn't need to be addressed because there was a building there. Now there's no building there. Many of these older buildings had asbestos in them, lead-based paint. Those that are still standing and are going to be rehabbed, they need environmental investigations, they need property surveys, they need assessments, and then they need remediation. US Bank got hit pretty hard. There were 3 US Bank locations along Lake Street that were damaged. And this is an article that talked about what they intended to do. They intended to rebuild 2 of their 3 branches, which is, I guess, good in a sense. You're going to end up with, newer buildings that may be more functional. Some of them may have been approaching obsolescence. The one on 2800 East Lake is an example of this community engagement that occurred. They The US Bank folks heard from community leaders that that would be a good spot for kind of a mixed use project with some affordable housing. So US Bank has decided to essentially donate its land for that purpose. The branch bank that they're sort of losing at that location, they're going to rebuild elsewhere. And that hasn't started yet, and it's probably going to take a couple years to be completed, but there's lots of discussions going on now about what will happen at that site. How many units, how affordable will they be? It's got good proximity to other retail services on Lake Street. It's near light rail transit. So it's a good example of the new interesting types of developments that are resulting from all this adversity that occurred last year. All the people that are owning buildings and thinking about redeveloping them are also looking at how they can get assistance with recovery. And in my view, this breaks down into a couple different categories, some of which are relatively new. DEED has recently announced their Main Street Economic Revitalization Program. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Federal money through the American Rescue Plan Act is coming to Minneapolis and St. Paul and other cities. There are lots of local nonprofits and community organizations that are really involved in this up to their elbows, doing really important, groundbreaking, productive work. And of course, our local grantors, some of whom are represented here today. DEED has its redevelopment grant program. The Met Council provides pre-development grants, and then 4 local entities all provide brownfield investigation and cleanup grants. Let's talk about those in a little more detail. I and many others are still learning about the Main Street Economic Revitalization Program. Kristen pointed this out to me almost as soon as the legislation was passed. There's $80 million that's going to be available. My understanding is that half of that's going to go out in one round with the other half in a later round. And the interesting thing in talking with people about this is that they're sort of used to applying directly to a grantor like DEED or the Met Council. This is a case where there's going to be intermediaries. There are going to be nonprofit organizations and foundations, et cetera, that will get the money from DEED, as I understand it, and then they will coordinate the distribution of that money to appropriate recipients. And this is based not only on the civil unrest that occurred, but it's also at least partly related to the pandemic, because that's had big impacts also. The request for proposals, I think, came out in July. It was a pretty quick turnaround time. Responses were due a couple days ago on August 31. I'm sure DEED staff members are busy reviewing them at this time. My understanding is that they're going to identify a group of eligible partner organizations. So we have EPO as a new acronym that we'll be hearing a lot about. And I think the goal is to identify those EPOs during September and then roll out the first 40 million in funds to them, and then they will interact with others that are interested in getting that money, of whom there will be many. This is my understanding of how it's structured. I've highlighted the ones that are kind of related to the presentation today. You have to have certain qualifying conditions in order to get some of this DEED funding. Property damage due to fire, arson, civil unrest, etc. Employee closures or multiple commercial space vacancies. There's lots of empty buildings up and down Lake Street, University, elsewhere because of the civil unrest. And then there's a pretty broad range of categories there for eligible costs. And you can see that demolition and site preparation is included in there. The second category I mentioned earlier was this federal legislation, the American Recovery Act. Minneapolis was approved for $271 million. Half of that's already been received. St. Paul also got a large influx of funding, other cities. The city council's already adopted a phase 1 spending plan. Now, this money isn't specifically allocated to the types of redevelopment costs that I've been talking about thus far. The council has decided to allocate the money in this fashion. As you can see, a good portion of it, 41% of the first influx of federal money has been designated for economic rebuilding. It's not necessarily physically rebuilding, but it's rebuilding in other ways. The staff reports and the council actions talk about things like support for small businesses, activation of the city's cultural districts through events and targeted services, job training for unemployed and low-income residents, financial support, etc. The details of some of this, these details are still being worked out. It's not completely clear to me whether support for small businesses would include providing funding for things like phase 1 and phase 2 site assessments. But we'll find out more about that in time. Local nonprofits and community neighborhood organizations have really gotten involved in this. I think the phrase stepping up is overused these days, but these organizations really, really did. And among them, and perhaps at the forefront, is the Lake Street Council. They adopted a number of new initiatives to address some of the problems that were experienced here. You can get a We Love Lake Street Recovery Grant under some circumstances by applying to them. In their first round, they awarded $5.5 million worth of grant funding to over 300 businesses. That's a lot of money for a small local nonprofit. And as you can see from these excerpts that I took from their website, 82% of the awards went to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants, et cetera. It was kind of designed not for the huge corporate entities. There was a specific limit of $3 million on annual revenue and a maximum of 100 employees. And where did this money come from, you may ask? I asked. It came from lots of different sources. In fact, think about what a large number would be for the number of contributors to the Lake Street Council. I was initially thinking 1,000, 2,000. They had over 70,000 individual contributions to the Lake Street Council. And that 70,000 number in here that I have somewhere, later on their website, they increased that to 80,000 contributors. In a short span of time, they had another 10,000 contributors. These are individuals, these are corporations, these are foundations, and this is very faint. It's sort of hard to see. In fact, I can't even see the numbers myself from here, but they got, I think, over 400 applications, and they chose to award funds to 328 of those. 328 grant awards. You know, in a normal brownfield round in Minneapolis, I might get, 40 applications to review, and I think that's a big job, So they got 400 that they reviewed in a very short span of time. They had $10 million worth of requests. They ended up handing out like $5.5 million worth of money. These were all relatively small grants. They averaged $15,000, but for a small business owner or operator, that could make a big deal. Again, 82% immigrant or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. 93% local ownership. I was interested in the 59% uninsured. I was kind of surprised by how many businesses just don't have insurance to cover these types of things. And the average number of employees was 4. So this money went to relatively small operations, but there are lots of them, and they contributed to the vibrancy on Lake Street. In addition to these relatively smaller grants, they also had an acquisition and pre-development grant program. It's a subpart of the We Love Lake Street Recovery Fund. There are larger dollar amounts here. They've got 2 categories, one for acquisition and one for pre-development. The acquisition funding is up to $100,000 per project. And for pre-development, they can approve grants up to $50,000 per project. And I did highlight environmental phase 1 and phase 2. I mean, some of the people that I would ordinarily talk to in Minneapolis about getting involved in the regular semi-annual grant rounds, I'm not seeing some of them because they're able to get this money from the Lake Street Council on sort of a rolling basis through successive grant rounds. It's less competitive, they get it faster, can put it to work faster. And it's not just the physical rebuilding. They also have a Be Well Lake Street program where they arrange to provide mental health counseling services for no out-of-pocket cost. People that were affected by the civil unrest, which I think it's very progressive. It's funded in part by a donation from United Health Group. So let's talk a bit about the local grantors here. Deeds Redevelopment Grant Program, which many of you are familiar with. I didn't see any unrest-related applications in the September 1 round this year, mostly because people weren't really ready to go. They couldn't provide me with the specifics that I thought I would need to give deed in order for them to conclude that these projects were project ready. But I think many of them will be ready in a few months, and I think Kristen and her crew will be seeing some applications from the city in the February 1 round of next year. The Met Council has lots of different grant programs, as you know, and the the city got some interest in seeking LCDA and LCDA TOD grant funding. We submitted some applications, and in June, the Met Council awarded 2 grants, $75,000 for the Chicago Lake rebuild, which was a project or a property on Lake Street that was significantly damaged and had to be torn down. And then 3030 Nicollet, which was a Wells Fargo branch, another bank that got hit pretty hard, that was also severely damaged. So they got $150,000 to do pre-development planning. These pre-development grants are interesting because these are the projects that we may see in future Brownfield grant rounds once they decide what the nature of their project is going to be and what the timetable will be. This is 810 East Lake Street. This is the one that had to be raised. It was a Foot Locker and a tobacco shop. It's gone now. This was the Wells Fargo branch, and there's going to be affordable housing on that site, plus a new Wells Fargo branch. That's one of the ones that was torched, not burned down, but damaged by fire so severely that it was just could no longer be used. Continuing, the Brownfield grants. As you know, Deed, Met Council, Hennepin, and Ramsey County all have Brownfield grant programs. I deal with the first 3. We had a fall 2020 round. We didn't get any unrest-related applications. I also didn't get any for the May 1, 2021 round, and I've got too early and too late. The reason for that is that these grant rounds were both too early in the sense that many of these redevelopment sites, had not yet decided what they're going to be, what's going to happen there, who the developer is going to be, what are we going to build. They just weren't in a position, again, to fill out a grant application and provide meaningful information that would help the grantors decide whether they want to help clean up that site. It's also too late in the sense that there were some contaminated properties that just did not have the luxury of waiting for a grant round to run its course. It takes a couple months, as you know, and some of these buildings were just damaged so severely that they had to be torn down. Debris had to be hauled away. There were contamination issues to address, but they just had to find out ways of addressing that on their own. In the fall 2021 round, we had a pre-application deadline for that round at the city of September 1. I do have 2 applications that will be going to the Met Council for 2 vandalized locations on Lake Street, 401 East Lake and 1108 East Lake. Here's 405 actually. This is an older 2-story building built in 1901. They're going to seek seed grant funding for a phase 1 ESA site assessment and a hazardous materials assessment. This is 1108 East Lake Street. This is a 1-story furniture store in a 1922 building. There's a guy named, he goes by Abe Damage. He owns both these properties and he has some lofty ambitions for them. But he's a real go-getter. He wants to put up 5- and 6-story buildings on these sites. One with affordable housing and one with office suites for other minority businesses. I'll talk briefly about the challenges of dealing with some of these parties. I've gotten spoiled over the years by dealing with the large corporate developers where you have like one point person to talk to and you have one experienced environmental contractor to talk to. And you send emails and make phone calls and you get immediate responses. It makes my job very easy. But the folks that I'm dealing with now to a large extent are a completely different group of people. Many of them, English is not their first language, so there are communication challenges. Many of them want government assistance, but they're still a little bit wary of us. When I first started doing government work, someone once said to me, what are the 10 words that business owners fear the most? I'm from the city and I'm here to help you. So many of us have spent our careers trying to refute that belief. But once you get over that hurdle, you're okay with them. Communications, it's like feast or famine. You'll get 10 phone calls in 2 hours, and then you won't hear from them for 2 weeks. And then you'll get 20 phone calls in the next 2 days. It's very sporadic, but they're being pulled lots of different ways, and they've got very steep learning curves. They're occasionally reluctant to hire professional consultants. They want to try to go it on their own, which creates challenges. Minneapolis and many other cities are sort of process-rich environments where you have to go through multiple steps and it's very exacting, and they're sort of intimidated by that to some extent. So I think the role of city staff members is to help them get through the process. On the positive side, in my view, these people exemplify the American spirit. They're resourceful, they're persistent, They're very family oriented. If you talk with the developer, the next day you'll talk with his cousin, his brother-in-law, his uncle. You get all their family members involved because they each have a little area of expertise. And they're ambitious. They're saying, I've got a one-story building, only a couple thousand square feet, but why can't I build a 6-story building that has affordable housing? So they're ambitious in a good way. And the most rewarding thing is, we get to help people who need it the most. I will kind of wrap up with what I think is kind of a feel-good story. There was a distillery that had a warehouse near Lake Street that was severely damaged by fire. And the owner is Chris Montana, which I think is a really cool name to start with. Any name that has a state in it is a cool name. Just ask Indiana Jones. This is him. He was, at one time, the only black distiller in the entire country. And he worked his way up, and at one time he was president of the American Craft Spirits Association. And here he is in his brewery, but his warehouse was damaged. And the pandemic also forced him to close his cocktail room, and a lot of his business vanished overnight, and then his warehouse was burned down. What they did was, they took their damaged warehouse and they turned it into a food bank. And people made contributions to him and to his business. And he took that money and he basically fed 400 families for months and months and months out of this location. He converted his liquor operation to a manufacturing hand sanitizer at a time when that was in short supply. And he kept his staff and employees busy doing that and helped the community. And then they say no good deed goes unpunished. Word of his work of this kind got around, and a e-commerce liquor distributor contacted him and now ships his liquor to 40 states. And he's making more money from his distillery than he was before the pandemic and before the civil unrest because of these things that he did to help his local community. So his last endeavor, and the last thing I want to talk about before questions, if any, he wants to do something to help Lake Street, and he wants to create a location where emerging minority entrepreneurs can launch their own food and beverage businesses. And he's found a building. His distillery is going to be the ground floor anchor tenant, and it's going to be here in the Coliseum building, which is one of the largest existing structures on Lake Street. It's 100 years old, 80,000 square feet. This picture was from the 50s, I think. It's at Lake and 27th. This is an article from 2012 when the ownership changed hands, but it's a Lake Street icon. And it was damaged by fire so badly that there was talk of tearing it down. And Seward Redesign, which is an organization that many of you are familiar with, Seward Redesign bought it a couple months ago. Here's an example of what it looks like inside: water damage, fire damage. Seward Redesign is going to fix it up and make it a center for a variety of businesses. Chris Montana's Du Nord Craft Spirits is going to be in there, a company called Urban Design Perspectives, and Common Sense Consulting at Work. It's going to be a cooperatively owned office space type of environment where Black entrepreneurs can own and utilize their own office space. And it's their attempt to help a demographic that's been often left out of the development conversation. It's an example that equitable development is possible, says Seward. So these are very, I think, heartwarming stories, to me at least. And I will just end by saying that, not all of these properties were burned down, not all of them were fire damaged, but all of them were adversely affected in one way or another. And one of my favorite quotes is that only from the ashes of who we are can we rise up to become who we're to be. So that's what's happening with many of these sites. It's already happening. It'll continue to happen for years. And brownfield investigations, brownfield remediation, and brownfield grant funding will be part of it. That's all I have. I'll answer questions if you have any, but I think our time is pretty limited, right?
Got a couple minutes for a question and answer. If anybody has questions for Kevin. Any questions in the chat? No. I have a question.
All right.
You talked a lot about kind of community engagement and what that looks like for specific development sites. You also talked about building trust with the developers and the local business owners. How does the city do community engagement in educating on kind of potential funding sources? And also, how do you work to build trust in communities that might not already trust you?
One of the things that we do, and as part of the Brownfield grant process, we have a form we developed years ago called the Grant Assessment Worksheet. And when someone calls me up and they express an interest in pursuing grant funding, we have them fill that out. There are sections in there regarding various types of project readiness criteria. One of them is community or neighborhood engagement. We found out the hard way that some projects come to us and they want to go to the council and get support for a grant application, and they don't go to the local neighborhood organization. So we basically require them to tell us, have you gone to them? If you haven't gone to them, when do you intend to do so? Give us a date. If you did go to them, did they take an action on your proposal? Did they write a letter of support? Did they have criticisms, et cetera? So we encourage them to get out into the neighborhoods and talk with them so that the community has an opportunity to offer input on the project. It almost always results in a better project in the end. Some developers are resistant to it, and others aren't. There's a wide spectrum, but in many cases when you're dealing with lot coverage and height and amenities and things like that, because of the community engagement, it's a better outcome. In terms of building trust, it's just the usual stuff. You try to explain things to people in a way that they understand. You have to keep asking them, do you understand this? Can I explain it in more detail? A lot of these people are very proud in a good way, and they don't like admitting that they don't understand something. So they'll often sort of nod their heads, and then it's immediately apparent because of something they do or say that they don't really understand what to do or what's involved. So you just have to keep explaining it to them over and over again and be patient with them, especially with people for whom English is a second language. I saw a meme online the other day that said, what's the most significant thing about someone who speaks with broken English? And the answer was courage. These are people who are trying to communicate with you in your language, and it's a new one for them, and it's hard for them. So they try very hard, and you have to acknowledge that and do all you can to help them. And I think over time, if you have enough interactions with them, if you produce results for them and help them understand the process, they begin to trust you. And because of their family connections, with immigrants, it's all family related. If you convince one family member that you're there to help them, all the rest of the family starts to think that. So it's a slow process. You build it up over time, but it does work.
Any other questions for Kevin?
All right, thank you.